It's my tripod, also known as my little finger. Steadies your hand. And it's free. Came with a There we go. Interesting, not really great. I can always fix it later. And here's the one that scares people. The stem. Your darkest dark, your lightest light, all right here in the same area. When people look at your work, their eye is going to go to that area of highest contrast. So your darkest dark and your lightest light. If they're right next to each other, it's going to grab their attention. They'll go straight there and stay put. I'm going to skip a little space between those that I just put down and this, just to keep them from running together. So I'm just going to paint this in with really wet, juicy new gamboge. First time you do this, you'll say, sure looked easy when she did it. And that's only because I do it a lot. The first one of these you do will be challenging. The second one will be better. The one after that will be even better. And often it's a good thing to prop this up a little bit, and often just laying it on your masking tape roll is good enough. I'm going to run this down the side. And you look at this and go, why is she doing blue and yellow stems? I'm going to hold it sideways and let that kind of run over. It creates a feathered effect, which in the long run ends up reading as texture in the stem. I want that to go down a little bit further. It may not. So if it's still blue when it dries, it's really not a big deal. I can come back, put another layer of the yellow across. No problem, as they say in the tropics. That's no problem, man, I think. If I painted that a solid color, it wouldn't be very interesting. It wouldn't have any volume. So you need to give it direction. In this case, you always want to think of light source, and actually in any painting you do. Values right here aren't quite right. I can tweak those later. But again, light source is coming from here. It just glances off this edge because this is so dense that it prevents it from hitting the rest of this. Keep your fingers out of your paint. This is almost a separate painting into itself. It's a two-sided petal. And in this case, again, I'm doing the yellow. I'm going to pick up just a touch. I want this to be very pastel. I don't know if you can see the little triangle here or not. These are things that you can paint. If you leave them out, the world certainly isn't going to come to an end. But if you put them in, it's much more interesting. So just to notice those sometimes is the fun part. I have a lot of architects and accountants and people who are very concerned with precise details, and trust me, they see all this stuff. Then I have the others who don't even see it at all. And nobody's right or wrong. This needs to dry, and when it does, we'll come back and put a pale layer of pink over it so it'll look like you're seeing through that petal to the pink flower. How do you know when it's dry? The first thing you do is hold it up. If it's shiny, it's obviously still wet. If it's raised, then it's still wet. The paper expands and contracts as it dries and gets wet. So when it's wet, it's sort of puffy, and then when it dries, it goes back to totally flat. This is very flat. These still puffy. That's a good reason to use blocks. These are bound around the edges. If I use larger sheets of paper, I'll tape them down to a surface. In the old days, you'd take that big sheet of watercolor paper, throw it in the bathtub and let it soak. Then take it out and tape it all the way around on a board or staple it around on a board. Well, thank God for new stuff. I just want to paint. This, I want to make this darker. I see that here the values are dark underneath. I see here on the black and white copy the darkest darks, even down here, and then even in here. And we'll work on that as well. The first part is the painting, the basics. Do all the basics, then you come back and put in the little details. And it's those fine details that make it come together. Or fix it. Things like this white space between this leaf and the rosebud itself. That reads it's just unfinished. There's no reason it would be white there. So this has to come up or this has to come back. Not a problem. Same thing over here. And I will connect these shapes in a minute when they dry. Now, right now I'd still run the risk of having those all bleed into each other. So while we're in the waiting step, this, if you see it in this photograph, looks bumpy. There's a texture to it. There's a technique called dry brush, and basically is exactly that. You want to put some paint on your brush. Using these nylon ones, they're a little bit stiffer, and they probably work a little bit better for this. You don't want it to be soaking wet. You want to lay it on the seam, as it were, and just drag it across. The texture of this paper is sort of bumpy, so when you do this, you're really trying to get paint to sit on the high spots, but not go into the valleys as it would if it were very wet. So that gives it some movement, gives it a little bit of texture. If you have too much of this, you just come back in with a almost dry brush and then just soften. Very gently. You see where I'm holding the brush? Back here. When you hold it down here, it makes you bend over and then your face goes like this and you get wrinkles everywhere, so you don't want to do that. Back off. Put your paper almost at an arm's length. Hold this back here on the balance point. It will free you up to be a much better painter. It also gives you a much greater range of motion. When you hold it down here, your range of motion is limited to this. When you hold it back here, you can paint the world, theoretically. So I'm just softening this, trying to mimic that movement. So we've already learned an awful lot with this one little painting, and it's a great one to start with. When you want to come back and deepen these, you could start over again. You could do the very same thing twice. If you want more control, now's a good time to take your blue and your green. If you're going for a dark color, start with the darkest color. Start with the blue, add a little bit of yellow. Don't go straight into here and try to mix colors. Every time you do, you don't have any control over how much paint you pick up. So you want to make sure that you have the same amount. Work from puddles and add a little bit at a time. And that'll get you where you want to go a lot quicker and less frustrating. I'm going to turn this upside down. Again, I'm trying to fill in that little gap on both sides. And in this case, I'm just going to blend this out like we did with the pink areas. Cover up that little white blob. Didn't make it all the way to the big time, so I'm going to pull that out a little bit. If it's too wet, it's going to mess up that section that you've got painted in there. All right, dark.